So we finally have her, and she very graciously accepted. I'll tell you why. They've just she and her husband Milind have just had a child recently. Uh, Pratibha, how old is Ananya? Hi, Pratibha, are you there?
She's on mute.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yeah, there you are. Hi.
She's 3 months now.
3 months, okay, right. Please do put up a picture if you're comfortable doing that. Anyway. But Pratibha comes to us with a lot of experience in design. Having worked in Samsung and Oracle before, and most recently, however, her is her founding of Andor Design. I would say it was founded by a couple of designers, but I mean it in the literal sense. They are husband and wife, so that makes it a. Is it unique in the field of design? Probably not. No.
Yeah, I don't think it's as unusual as you might think.
Okay, cool. Anyway, so apart from this, Pratibha is an excellent guitarist, and I think you should ask her to, play a song in the end if she's willing. So, if you're up to it.
It's been a while.
Okay. Cool. So, Pratibha, this is a very free-flowing thing. We'll keep chatting, and you can go ahead with the presentation. And if there are any questions that come up on chat, I'll interrupt you at the right time and ask.
Okay, sure.
If you can somehow see it anyway, please feel free to answer. Anyway. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
I don't want to break your rhythm. I'll jump in whenever it works for you. All right.
Okay.
Cool. Over to you.
Great. So yeah, I'm going to be talking a little bit about how my insights on how designers can grow in their career, apart from what the title says, which is what you don't learn in design school. Before I jump into that, I want to talk a little bit more about what my journey has been like. I actually started off with an interest in computer science. So when I was in school, I really enjoyed coding, and so when it came time to decide what to do, I know engineering is kind of the obvious option for a lot of people, but I genuinely wanted to do it. So I did an undergrad in computer science. But kind of along the way, I felt like something was missing. Uh, I couldn't understand, what we were doing, why we were doing it. It was a lot more about the how and the technical aspects of it. So I started kind of looking around, and that's when I began to hear about user-centered design. It was kind of in the early days back then, but it was something that really piqued my interest. And I did a bunch of research and looked at different universities where I could study this. And I ended up going to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and that was back in 2007. Um, and I did a master's in human-computer interaction there. And it was really good. It really opened up my outlook a lot because I met people from a whole bunch of diverse backgrounds. I took so many different courses. I did a lot of hands-on project work. Um, it was kind of an immersion into academia, but so there was a rigor of academia, but it was also like I said, very hands-on. And after that, I worked for a while. So I was really interested in user research. And at the time, and even today, I think there's a lot more focus on design as a practice as opposed to research. But research was where my interest lay back then. And so I worked in Oracle as a usability researcher. And then I moved to Bangalore. From there, joined Samsung. And those were the days when there was a lot of emerging markets research going on. Nokia was big back then, and they were doing a lot of pioneering work in the field. And it's interesting how it's kind of come full cycle now, because now you hear about next billion users, which is just the same thing in a different incarnation, right? So anyway, I was doing user research at Samsung. We were looking at a whole emerging markets and sort of more future ready things. But somehow over the course of my time there, I kind of did this pivot from research into design. And I've kind of now, and since then I've been sort of more a pure designer. I haven't got that much opportunity to do research. So now I wouldn't even call myself a researcher. I am now more of a designer. So anyway, while I was at Samsung, what happened after a few years was I started again to feel like something was missing. I felt like being in a company is great because any little thing you do has a lot of impact because the number of users are that much bigger. But it also means that you're just like a small cog in the wheel, so you don't really feel your individual impact. And Milind, who was my partner in Ando Design, was also feeling similar things at his workplace. And so we ended up coming together to form Ando Design, which was really exciting times. I think we kind of rode that wave where startups were just starting to become big. It was design was still people knew about it, but it wasn't as established as it is right now. And so we got to work on a lot of exciting things. We worked with Sharon as well on a couple of projects.
It's been a long time now.
Yeah, it is a long time. So we worked with a bunch of startups where we would be working directly with the co-founders. Sometimes they were just coming in with an idea, so we were getting to cross between design and product work. We also worked with bigger companies where there were more established processes and things were more structured. So overall, it's been really interesting being on my own. So when I thought about when you asked me to give a talk, I was thinking what can I talk about. This was something that came to mind, that it's been kind of a journey over the last 13 years where I've been in academia, I've worked with kind of the more corporate environments, and I've also been in the startup environment, and I've been on my own. So along the way, I kind of looked back and thought of these different things that I've learned that you don't really realize when you're in design school or just starting out in your career. And I thought that would be interesting to share today.
I'm really looking forward to it. Having not been through design school, there's a lot that I can learn.
Right. So let's actually start off by talking about why design school is important, because I do think there is a real value to that, even if my title might sound a little flippant. So design school is a really solid foundation for you as a designer. So you learn things like design thinking. You learn the tools and processes to bring a little bit more structure into what can be a pretty subjective, intuitive, field. You learn a lot from your peers. Sometimes I feel you learn more from them than you do from your professors, because people come from all these different walks of life and they have so many different mindsets that you work with them. So that brings a lot to the experience as well. And then you learn, you might specialize in different areas of expertise, maybe like animation or visual design or interaction design, and so on. So it's good for all these different reasons. In fact, when I was a few years into my career, I felt now would be a good time to actually go and get a design degree. But anyway, even though it's great for all of these things, what it really does focus on is building kind of a skill and craft and kind of a basic mindset to work as a designer. So it's great for laying the groundwork, but it's not enough for you when you actually are thrown out there and you're working in the real world. So what I wanted to talk about is, how do you grow beyond that? So over the course of this talk, I've come up with a set of 7 insights, and we kind of go through them by starting from more external facing aspects. And then as we walk through them, they start to get a little bit more internal. And the reason I feel like this makes sense is because when you're kind of fresh, you're hungry, you're eager, you want to learn, you're basically looking for a lot of different inputs, and you want to do a lot of stuff. So you're always looking externally a lot more. As you start, getting more and more experience, what starts happening is you start seeing these patterns, you start seeing things recurring, and you start observing certain behaviors, and then you start to think more about what you're doing or what you're observing, and you start building this kind of a value system for yourself, a set of things that you want to be as a designer, or things that the way you want to do things. So it's kind of like a wheel in that sense. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're wondering how these things are going to be structured. Okay, so let's just jump right into it. The first thing I think, first insight I had was to go beyond the user and to understand the business. And why this is important is in design school, we're often taught to put the user at the heart of the experience. Think from the user's point of view. You are the voice of the user in an organization. And this is very true. And we definitely have to do this, because if we don't, no one else is going to fill that role. That said, I feel like we sometimes might get a little bit too narrow in our outlook, where we're only thinking about the user. It's important to kind of understand the context that you're working in, because you are working in a company, and their goal is to sell a product or to get more subscriptions, or increase the revenue, whatever that it might be. And you can only be good at your job if you're also being effective in helping them do that. Which is why I feel it's important for designers to understand the business as well. So how I think of it is, you need to form the business context. So as a designer, you keep the designer at heart, at your core, but you also kind of draw on different aspects from the business function to inform your work. So how do we form the business context? I feel like this comes from asking questions and having conversations with the business leadership, with product managers. Uh, Try and find out things like, what is the long-term vision for this product? Because as a designer, you're often more focused on the day-to-day of it. Like, this is a particular feature that we want to build. This is coming out in the next few months or whatever. But what's the long-term vision for your product? Where's it going to be in a couple of years, say? Then what's the business model of your company? How do they make revenue? Is it through subscriptions? Are they selling something? What is it that users are going to have to interact with in order for the company to get business? Then go a little bit beyond the product itself and think about the company. Like, where is this company growing? So today, for example, your company might just be into mutual funds, but tomorrow it might want to be a much bigger financial platform, which again will inform some of the design decisions you want to make upfront so that they're scalable. And how do all the different products tie together? But this is more the case when you're working in a bigger company that has a whole suite of products. There is going to be something that connects all of these products, and typically you as a designer would be focused on just one of them if it's a large design team. In which case it's important for you to know what the other products are, how do they affect what you're working on. It gives you a lot more context to as you design. So when you have design and you combine that with a business context, as a designer, you get a robust understanding of the problems that the business is trying to solve. Now, what often ends up being the case practically is that you might receive a brief as a designer, or you might sit down with the product manager and they might just tell you, here's what we need to do. So it kind of becomes some sort of context kind of gets lost in translation when we rely on just these methods. But when we start asking questions and understanding the larger context of the business, we have a much deeper understanding of the business. And when we have this deeper understanding, it helps us make better decisions. So, for example, let's say you're solving a very specific problem. It could even be a small one, and you've come up with 3 different ways to do it. How do you decide which way is the best way? You definitely use user experience heuristics to make that decision. But if you're also using the business goal, for example, or as an input, then that gives you a lot more clarity and helps you decide which one is going to be most effective. And with this informed decision making, we end up designing more impactful solutions. So you end up designing things that are likely to get more buy-in, likely to get more consensus from all of the stakeholders, and therefore more likely to get released, and get used by the people that you're designing for. So it's just to summarize this part, it's basically keep the user at the heart, yes, but do definitely go beyond that and understand the business goals a little bit more detail, so that you can do your work better and create more impactful design.
Pratibha, if you take a question here, in understanding the business, have you run into situations where you had to help them articulate what their vision is as a client?
Yeah, I think so. I think, and especially like I mentioned, working with startups, because they might even just have really simple idea, like I want to build a Swiggy for XYZ or something like that, right? And we just want you to come in and help us build a great experience. Sure. And many times it's happened that we start from there and we start from a really simple user brief, but as we go deeper and deeper and start creating our work, we come up with all these questions like, hey, would your user want to do this or that, or is this person our user, or is this person also our user, or what kind of do we want to cater to this scenario or not? Does this make sense? And when we start having those kinds of conversations, I think the product and the vision of the product starts getting kind of more solid.
Okay. Have you ever wished you had like a financial degree or something, a degree in finance to understand a business better?
No, actually. So the way I look at it is, it's important. I think as designers, we tend to be generalists in a sense because we bump around in a lot of different industries, and we have to understand healthcare. You have to understand, I don't know, telecommunication. You have to understand all of these different things, right? And you can't go around getting degrees in all of it. What happens is when you start working in something, you end up digging in and doing a lot of research, talking to a lot of people that are experts in the field, right? Your coworkers, and it's kind of an incremental thing that keeps building that knowledge base.
Okay. All right. You brought up one point earlier. So in design school, we are taught to think of being user-centric, right? But when you come out, I think you learn quickly that you're the servant of two masters. So how do you balance that between the
Sorry, you
company and
learn
the
quickly what?
customer? The servant of two masters between the
Right.
company and the customer. So
Right.
how do you balance that?
Right. So I think the way is, like, at least how I've kind of done it is, it's like a being on a balance, like a tightrope act, right? So you obviously, like, I start from the user. I understand product. I understand what it is that they're trying to do, that the business is trying to do, and then I'm trying to think of experiences that will make that smoother. And along the way, you might run into issues like, for example, business might want to push XYZ because that will drive more conversion or more revenue, but from an experience point of view, it's intrusive, or maybe there's a privacy issue there. And then it's sort of, you bring those things up and you discuss it with the leadership and you say, hey, if you do this, you want to build a trustworthy brand, but if you do it this way, then this is going to be an issue. So how about we do it in this manner where it's a little bit more subtle, but so it's sort of a case by case thing. But I guess it is to articulate it to yourself as a designer,
Sure.
understand where the other person is coming from, and then kind of make your arguments.
Okay. I'll stop here.
Okay. That's actually a nice segue into my next insight, which is to speak so that other people listen. Um, so in design school, you learn that you have to speak and talk and present your work and all of that. And we just spoke about gathering business context. But the thing is, you need to, for you to really get buy-in, you have to speak in such a manner that other people really hear what you're saying, and so that it resonates with them. How can we do that is what I'm going to talk about. The first step is actually to know your audience. As a designer, you're probably going to be dealing with a bunch of different functions within a company. So you'll be really talking to business leadership, product engineering, design, other designers, and what you say and how you say it should change. It should be tailored to the people that you're speaking with. So if you're presenting a solution to design leadership, for example, you don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of the details. You want to talk about how your solution ties in with the larger business goals, for example, how it's going to drive revenue. If you're talking to product managers, you might want to talk in terms of how a particular feature, particular interaction will drive conversion or increase engagement or something like that. If you're talking to engineering, I think this is the most common thing that most designers deal with. Enough like that, but also think about giving them some sorts of rules or guidelines, maybe a design system or something, so they can extrapolate and not have to look at everything, wait on you for every single thing. And then finally, there's the design team, and I think this is where we're most at home because we can use our own vocabulary, our own language, which non-designers don't always understand. So we're comfortable here. We go into as much detail as we want, and this is kind of our home. But knowing our audience and tailoring our message makes it all that more easier for them to get the message that you're trying to make. The other thing is to speak in narratives and not in UI. So it's very tempting, I think, especially when you're just starting out, that you've done all this work and the expectation from many people also, non-designers, is that what does a designer do? They create mock-ups, right? So show me mock-ups. So to avoid falling into that trap, I think you need to speak, kind of articulate your entire solution in the form of a narrative. Um, and this is a method that's used in creating designs as well, but I'm talking about this specifically in terms of presenting your work now. So what does that mean exactly? So when you're working, you kind of create all these internal narratives in your head, and it might be something that's so subtle that you don't even realize it yourself. You don't articulate it to yourself. And so when you look at your output, you just think in terms of, user flows, or final mockups and things like that. So I feel like a narrative approach is a lot more effective in presenting it. How can we do that? This is an example of what's a typical story arc. So in stories have this arc where you kind of have an introduction, you have like a rise up, and then you have hit a climax, and then you have the kind of the resolution. And this is something that you could do when you're making a presentation about your design. So you start with an introduction. So here, this is where you talk about the personas, and they need to be not just personas that you dreamt up in your head, which I know we're all guilty of doing in design school, but these are personas you need to have created based on user research, or speaking with users, speaking with product, basically well thought out, well researched personas. So identify who they are, what are their motivations. Then you go into the build up. So you start talking about the challenges that these personas face. What are they trying to do? What are the issues they're facing? What are the breakdowns? And as you keep coming up with that, you're building up to your breakthrough. And when you hit the breakthrough, that's kind of like your big reveal. So that's, hey, here's all of these problems, and now here's the key idea, or here's the key theme of my solution. And then that has to be like just a very simple idea, like a really high level idea. And once you hit that note, then you start going into the details of the nitty gritty of your solution, the different use cases, and keep tying it back to the build up, which was the problems that you were outlining. And that's kind of your resolution. And when you do it in this way, what happens is that people get that story, and it's a lot easier then to connect with what they're seeing, what they're being presented, and see how that is really solving the issues at hand, as opposed to, like I said, just talking through a bunch of mocks and saying, you click here and then this happens and then that happens. The other thing I feel is important to get others to listen is to make stakeholders a part of your journey. Now, many times stakeholders might have this thing that, we're going to give you your brief, and then you do your work, and then you come back. And then you come back and then you present something, and then there's just a breakdown, and they're like, wait, no, but this is not what we meant, and you haven't considered this, and this doesn't work, and this hole, and there's that hole. And then you're all disappointed that you put all this heart into it, and it's all you spend so much time and effort, and now all of this is being torn apart by your client or your manager or whoever your audience is. I think to avoid that, it's important to make stakeholders a part of every step of the way. So when you start out and you're gathering requirements, articulate it back to them so that you're both on the same page. As you start designing, have frequent check-ins. Don't wait till you have something more final or polished to show them. Keep having discussions at every point of the way, even if it's a really basic sketch, just a sketch on a napkin or whatever. Not a napkin sketch, but something low fidelity. Or if you have involve them in brainstorming as well, involve them in ideation. So the thing that happens is, as they make progress from the really rough early beginnings, and as things start to get more and more polished, when your stakeholder is part of that journey, they see all of the decisions that you are grappling with. They will give their inputs, which are really important for you to design something that's effective. So you get that much more feedback rather than just getting a dump in the beginning, right? And because they've been a part of this process and they've seen this thing grow, they're all that more invested now in the final solution. So when you come up and you have the final design ready, there's a lot more buy-in that's already happened. So your work is a lot less to convince people at this later stage. And then the next thing is to address constraints. Now, this is something that's definitely going to keep cropping up. you might design this perfect experience and then you go talk about it, and then engineering is like, no, we can't do this because we have this issue, and product is like, no, we can't do this because of that issue. This is something that's going to keep popping up every time you talk about your work, and we need to address these constraints. So the way I kind of think about it is to kind of break it down into these four steps. So the first step is to identify. So someone might say, oh, this is technically not possible, or it's going to take too long, so we can't do it this way, or our framework doesn't handle this. So you need to first identify what the constraint is and get the stakeholder to articulate it really clearly. The next step is to understand it. So this will involve some conversations with other people if it's not your core specialty, right? To understand, is it really that big of a constraint? Is it something that can be solved? Is it like something that we absolutely cannot do, doesn't make sense to do, or is it something we could do given 2 weeks instead of the 1 week that we currently have? So understand a little bit more, dive deeper into the constraint. Um, the third thing is to prioritize it from a design point of view. So from an experience perspective, how important is it for you to do this? And then kind of balance that against how much effort it would take to get it done. And with this information in mind, you design your trade-off. So your trade-off then kind of takes into mind both the experience, the ideal experience that you want to design, as well as the practical realities on the ground. And this is a way where you kind of create a balance between saying, no, we have to do this because it's really important for the user, because no one's going to argue with that. And obviously, experience is great, but if you can't do it, you can't do it. So you balance that with someone saying, just dismissing it because, let's say, it's easier for them to not do this right now. So overall, I think these are different ways in which you can get other people to listen. And the main thing I think here is that when you're in a room in a design discussion with a bunch of different stakeholders, many times there are a lot of really strong opinions getting thrown around. And it's not about you speaking louder, and that's not the way you get heard by just pushing your way through. The way you get heard is about finding the right arguments and then kind of doing it in the right way.
Will you take another question here?
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to talk about the prioritization a little, but prioritization in terms of which stakeholders are more important. It's often spoken about that there are these stakeholders, but I want you to kind of touch upon how do you prioritize which stakeholders' voice is more important. Obviously, everybody thinks their version is the right one.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think obviously business leadership ends up being the most important. So because they are the ones that drive the vision of the company, so that does tend to be the most important one. I think after that it tends to be product driving the direction, and engineering kind of uh, reacting with, yes, this is possible, no, this is not possible. The only difference I've seen where this is not necessarily true is if it's a very tech heavy company, like if it's a machine learning company where tech is the one that's driving it. And then many times in these places, product is a little weak anyway, because especially the early stage, there's a bunch of engineers that are really have gotten deep with something, and they're just building this thing that is really sound technically, but they haven't yet got to the point where they're thinking about building it into a marketable product. So it's more early stage. So in these cases, engineering tends to be kind of the louder voice. Very rarely does design tend to be the loudest. I think we still need to kind of have to keep speaking up and making ourselves heard.
Okay. When it comes to functionality, I like the way you prioritized it. But when it comes to aesthetics, how do you think it should go?
Hey, I didn't catch the last bit.
So when it comes to aesthetics or the look and feel of something,
Yeah.
do you think the prioritization would be the same? Or which stakeholder do you think you should listen to more?
Do you mean the look and feel as opposed to the functionality of a product? Yeah. Well, I believe that the function is more important at the end of the day, because if I had to give an answer, because I think you can make something really pretty and then you start using it and then it breaks down for you. I think that still is a problem in our industry right now, is that people do kind of think of design as a little bit more in terms of the look and feel. That is the impression a lot of clients coming to you might have. uh, a lot of non-designers might have, and it's something I think we're still fighting. But it's definitely important. I mean, I'm not to say that that the aesthetic is not. It is definitely a part of creating a delightful user experience. We just need to find the balance.
Sure. I've often seen the marketing team take decisions on the look and feel of it. Do you feel that that's the right thing to do?
Yeah, that is. I mean that I think there you kind of go into you have to go into those difficult discussions where you have to talk about why something wouldn't work out in the long term if you're going for something that has just a look and feel but not the functionality.
Sure.
Yeah, we have a lot of those kind of conversations.
Okay. Cool. Carry on now, Pratibha.
Okay. So the third thing is to get comfortable with criticism. So we talked about getting the business context and speaking up in the right way. And when you do this, or even if you don't do this and you're just sitting quietly and producing your work, you are going to get criticism as a designer. That is a fact of life, and you have to get used to it, no matter how difficult that might be. Um, so how I think of it is one kind of criticism that we often get is the vague one. So it's when your stakeholder looks at the design and they're like, yeah, it's missing the wow factor, or make that pop a bit more,
This sounds funny.
make that a bit bigger. Yeah. So basically, or something like, I don't think this is going to work. Why don't we do it like Flipkart does it, or something really non-actionable. So I think the thing here is to kind of step back and take the emotion out of it. Just listen, just listen. Get them to articulate what it is, why they have that problem. So maybe start by asking an open-ended question like, why do you think that is an issue, or can you talk a little bit more about that, and kind of listen to them. If that still doesn't give you something clearer, then maybe kind of frame your understanding and say, okay, according to me, this is what we're trying to achieve here, and this is why I've done it this way, and have them react to that, and that maybe that conversation will lead to them talking a bit more in specifics. But the whole point is to have a conversation with them so that you don't go you don't end up just reacting to them saying just do this doesn't work, but really understanding what lies behind it, and then you have to then come up with the right solution. And this I thought was this is interesting. Don't defend your work, have a dialogue. So I think, especially in design school, many design schools have this concept of, um, defending your thesis. So you spend a lot of work doing your master's thesis or whatever, and you have to stand up in front of a panel and defend it. And that's definitely not the mindset we need to have when we're working in the real world, because it's not about you. It's objectively about the work that you're putting out there, and does that solve a product goals? Does that meet user needs? So you need to kind of detach yourself from that in a way. And again, it's just listen, take the emotion out of it, listen to the point that's being made, and then respond to that. And yeah, I mean, I think this is something that comes with experience. It's not something that happens overnight. When you start out, it's very easy to be defensive, to get offended, maybe even get a little bit aggressive because you feel the other person is being aggressive. But as the years wear on, you kind of go into more of a Zen mode, and you kind of feel like, okay, let's have these talks. That said, it's important not to suffer a bully, because there will most people when they give feedback, most co-workers, most clients, they're doing it purely because they had a thought and they just want to put it out there. But there are going to be some people that won't do it in a very nice way, and they'll be unnecessarily rude about it. And if that happens to you, it's important to know that that is not okay. It's totally fine at that point to call them out on that. So respond, like take their point. If there's a very specific thing they're saying, answer that, but be sure to say that, call them out on that behavior and say that this is not. I mean, like, just to give an example, like I was working on a project once where it was very early stage, and there was a larger product, and there was a very specific thing that a very specific feature that they wanted to create, and people hadn't given much thought to it. It was just like we should do X, Y, Z. And so I had spent some time on that and detailed out how I thought it could be done. And I was in a meeting with the CEO, the CTO, and a bunch of the engineering manager, and a bunch of engineers. And as I was I just started talking through this, and one of the engineers he just took a look at it and he started laughing. He's like, "What is this? And this is definitely not going to work. It doesn't make sense." And I was like, "Hang on a second. I've just got started. I've given this more thought than you have. So hear me out, and then let's talk." And other people stepped in. So the CTO stepped in at that point, and he told the engineer to it's okay, listen first. And then so it's important to know this, because as designers, I think we're often thrown into these kind of situations where we're dealing with a bunch of different like whole set of engineers and maybe a product manager, and it's easy to feel intimidated. I think the thing is to stand your ground, to answer the questions and to pose the questions yourself, but not to take not be bullied.
You're going to name the person and the company right now, aren't you? Okay.
So I mean, I spoke a little bit about how where although design has been growing, we're still sort of kind of setting the tone for things. We're still having to explain to people what it is exactly that we do, and part of our job then kind of ends up being to evangelize design within our organizations. And I think what we end up doing often is we keep talking about design and what it is that we do and why it's so important and things like that. But I don't know if that's the most effective way to get buy-in for design. I feel like it's more effective when you make your non-design coworkers allies of design. So how I think we could do that is one way is to articulate and share your process. So there's a lot of behind the scenes work that goes into the final output that someone might see, right? Uh, it can range from really detailed thinking to a bunch of really messy ideation. There's a lot of different things that we do, but someone else might just be seeing the final output. So I kind of think it's kind of important to articulate to yourself first what it is that the different ways in which you're ideating and solving the problem, and to share that with people. And it doesn't even need to be like you make this big presentation with all of the bunch of whiteboard photos of the whiteboarding and this and that. It doesn't need to be like a detailed thing. It could be as simple as maybe you designed something for a particular feature and you went around and spoke to 10 people and you have gotten some reactions. Typically, we might just keep it to ourselves and then we'll say, okay, so now this design makes the most sense. I'm going to go in this direction. Instead of just doing that, why not just shoot out an email to your team and say, hey, I just did this and here's what we learned. Because that helps them get more perspective about the user, but it also helps them get more perspective about what you do. And it's not just you sitting there and being creative. For example, if you're ideating, don't just do it by yourself. Maybe pull your product manager in and do it with them instead of going later on and saying, here's what I thought of. So it's just little things that we can kind of pull up along the way to keep making people more aware of what we do. Because I still get, people still say things to me like, oh, you're a designer, so, you must be really creative and you need to be in the right space to get inspiration. That's only then can you do your work, right? Or design is all about aesthetics. And, I literally had one person, a very senior engineering manager say to me, here's what we have, now bring your paintbrush and make it look nice.
Okay.
So it's important, like for him, and I worked with him later on, and and he was part of that process, and he saw some of the things that I was doing, and so I feel like that improved his outlook. It gave him a better sense of what design does, and then that may later on to then advocate for something based on the user experience from point of view. The other thing is to welcome inputs from non-designers. I think a lot of people, not necessarily designers, people outside of the design community also have this idea that designers are the ones that come up with these creative, innovative solutions. So, that's your job. But anybody can have a good idea, right? So an engineer could come up with a good idea. You need to be open to listening to inputs from a lot of different people. And when you do that, it kind of tends to you start having more of an open channel of communication with people that you may not have already had. So not only are you getting better ideas for your work, you're also the other person is getting heard and they're happy to be heard and know that because designers are difficult to work with is another stereotype, and I feel this is something that could help with that as well. Which actually brings me to the next one, which is to form meaningful connections with other functions. Um, so I feel like what tends to happen, especially in larger organizations, is you have these different silos. You have design sitting separately, you have engineering sitting separately, and then you have product which kind of floats between all of the functions. And this has its advantages. So as a designer, when you sit with the design team, you get to swap notes on what each other is working on, especially when you're all working on different products. You can share the problems that you're facing. You can get ideas and advice from each other. It's good to have that community, behind you. But on the flip side, it can sometimes lead to an othering of these other functions, right? You might feel like it's an us versus them sort of a situation, and I don't think that does anybody any favors. So while this is more of an organizational thing, I do feel it's important for this to come from the top to create kind of a more design-aware culture. I think as individuals, what we can do is form more meaningful connections with our coworkers. So for example, have a chat with your product manager. Don't or with an engineer. Don't kind of take it outside of the more formal meetings and discussions that we have like more informal conversations. It doesn't even have to be about the particular product that you're working on together. It could simply be get a product manager's perspective on, let's say, the new Paytm redesign or Zomato redesign or something like that. You talk to an engineer about what they do and how they do it and things like that, because that again, it broadens our outlook. And when you have those kind of connections, it helps better in uh, again getting your work done better. So one example, like a lot of times what happens is you might design and you might hand off to the engineering team, and then that's it. That's like you don't see anything after that until it comes out. And sure, many places have a better culture where there is a sort of a feedback loop where design is still sitting with engineering and you're able to kind of keep iterating even during the engineering phase. But I think what I mentioned is still a problem in many places. But if we have these kind of connections with people, they're more likely to reach out to you and say, "Hey, I was building this, and then this issue came up, and I was just going to solve it like this. But do you have any? Does that make sense to you?" And then you can say, "Hey, no, but how about you do it like this?" So it kind of, I think these informal connections are really important to keep cultivating as well. So I think ultimately, when you're trying to uh, let other people know what design is, it's important not just talk about what design does. It's more about to let them see it happen. So it's like a show don't tell kind of an approach.
Pratibha, before you start the next point, can I ask you another question?
Yeah.
So you spoke about how we can involve the others in the process of design and explain the details of, that it's not just, we just didn't make a choice because it's our opinion. But, you walk them through the steps that made us arrive there. But there are some times where we are making decisions in the dark, in the unknown. We don't have the data to back our decision making. How do you then speak about why you took this choice, or why you made this choice?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's definitely true. I think even though we try to make design very tangible and structured, it still plays to a large part subjective, right? Two different designers would come up with a different solution. Two engineers might not necessarily do so. Um, so I think again it comes back to then the business goals in a sense, as well as your understanding of the user perspective. So it's important to build both of these two things and then speak from that point of view. So sure, you might not have data to back it up or anything specific like that, but I think when you tell it within the context of the user, and this is why this would work. I feel again this is where narratives start to become important, because narratives are then things that people connect with that are not data based necessarily.
Sure.
So that could be another tool to kind of bring a little bit more structure into what is a pretty subjective discussion.
Okay, I have another question here from Nisha. She says, how do you deal with or talk to clients about bloated MVPs? In my experience, I have seen that they don't know where to draw the line when designing an MVP and keep adding features and functionalities.
Yeah,
I think that,
that's
yeah, we faced it all. Yeah.
Yeah, we face that a lot as well.
Yeah.
I think it is when that really comes to when the client really starts addressing that is when we start talking timelines. So they might come with, hey, we want to do this, all of this stuff, and then we're like, okay, but and then we actually sit down and think about it. We make like a roadmap and we say to do this so much time, so and so, and they see that and they see that, and then the cost, and they're like, wait a second, uh, how much can we do in 6 weeks? And then we start having those conversations. And you asked about that earlier, right? About uh, design kind of informing the product or the business. That's another aspect of that, right? So that's when you sit down, and when we start asking those questions, they also start thinking, that realizing that, okay, maybe this doesn't make sense. And then you start to converge on an MVP that is more succinct.
She just sent another message. Do you see it? Are there any strategies you use to estimate time for the projects?
Yeah, that's always been a difficult one. I think, especially when I was first starting out, that was something I had trouble with. How I kind of approached it is I would break it down. So I'd say, okay, this is what we're trying to reach. We want to build this particular set of features, and what do I want to do to build those features? Maybe for this particular project, it makes sense that I first start with having maybe doing an information architecture. Maybe I need some time to speak to users, or if it's a really specific technical thing, I need some time to speak to whatever that community is. So that might take this much time. Then once I have that, I'm going to write up this kind of this thing to articulate what it is we're doing, and then I want to have discussions at these points with the client. Then perhaps we'll go into actual ideation and so and so. And so then we break that down and we tell people this will take about a week. This might take 2 to 3 weeks. This might take so much. Again, the idea is to give them a little bit more transparency into your thought process rather than just saying this is going to take 3 months, because the 3 months are like what. So I think breaking it down and then talking with them helps, because then they might say things like, okay, then maybe we don't want to consider this feature right now. Or would it help if we gave you this information that might then cut down on this particular phase? So basically, you start out with estimating it by breaking it down into these different modules, and then speak with the client to define it even further.
Those are the questions at the moment.
Okay. So we just spoke about making people understand what the role of design really is, and I think the flip side of that is engineering and product and some of these other functions are a lot more established, so they don't have to go around explaining what they do, but designers still have to do that to some extent, which can sometimes kind of leave us on the back foot. So it may make us feel that we're not as kind of question ourselves a little bit, especially when we're in discussions with these other stakeholders. So I think it's important to know that design does have a seat at the table now, and so you do bring value, but also to articulate to yourself in many different ways what that value is, kind of internalize it, because as like you're moving inwards, as I mentioned earlier. So the first point that I want to talk about under this is to not be afraid to negotiate. It's quite easy, especially when you're starting out, to just you're interviewing at a company, or you're interviewing with a new client, and they just make an offer, and you have to then people have kind of get into a take it or leave it mentality. They don't realize that this is something that is negotiable. So don't be shy. I mean, you do negotiate if you feel like what you're being offered isn't enough. And how can you do that? Well, first you kind of so do research there. Then this is interesting. What makes you special? So the client might come thinking that, okay, you're as a designer, I need someone that will create. I already have the product idea. I already have the engineering team. I just need someone to create a bunch of screens for me. And so I believe that should cost this much. And then when you sit with them, you explain that it's not just that these are the other things that you do. You're going to help them. Again, you might help in defining the product. You're going to help in user research. These are the different value that adds that you bring with you, and that is why this is not enough. That's why we need this. So you can make those arguments to talk about how why you're different, why you're special. And then you think about what trade-offs you want to make. So for example, maybe you're really passionate about this social enterprise that's come up and they can't pay you much, but you're okay to take a cut to work on that project. Or maybe you're okay with being paid in a split between equity and a cash component. So these are different trade-offs that you might want to consider when you're negotiating. But ultimately, I think it's about having this conversation and not just taking what's given, and being okay with what you're offered. Because if you're not okay with it, I think it's better to walk away than lowball yourself and be unhappy. The next thing to consider is that it's not just the client or the company that's interviewing you, you are also interviewing them. It's very easy in this in an interview kind of a scenario to feel like the other person is in a position of power and you're there to please them. But while that is true to some extent, I think it's important for you to also think about uh, what you want to get out of that interaction. So, for example, is this a company or is this a space that I'm excited to be working in? Do they all, are they a design aware organization, or will I have to work to make them more design aware? If I'm a junior designer, maybe I'm looking more for some place that already has an established team, which has a good structure within the organization. Or maybe I'm more senior and I want to lead, and so I want to go to a place that will allow me to do that. So just a bunch of different aspects to consider where you are also doing some sort of evaluation in this process. And the next thing is to kind of set expectations. I'm sure we've all been there where we suddenly get this completely unreasonable ask in an unreasonable amount of time, and then we're caught on the back foot. And it's very easy again to get trapped into, especially if you're told this in a strong voice, to then try and please and really try hard to deliver what is unrealistic. Um, so we need to be able to set expectations and handle demands as designers. How do we do that? If you're a freelancer, if you're working on your own, then think clearly about what sort of a working model you want to establish for yourself. Are you going to charge in terms of time? Are you going to charge in terms of like a lump sum of cost? Uh, are you going to be working out of your office or theirs? How often are you going to be checking in with them? These kinds of things. If you're a designer that's working in a company, maybe you don't have much room to negotiate these kinds of things. But if there's something you feel is missing or could be done differently, then do have those conversations with your manager, for example. Or if you are a manager, then have conversations with the leadership to see what you can do. The next thing is to set boundaries. So you might get a call, late at night saying we need this within 2 hours because blah blah blah, or you might be asked to work on weekends or holidays. And while you need to do that, if it's truly an emergency, like let's say you have a release around on the corner or some really important feature just broke and you have to go there and help fix it, then yes, you need to pull your weight. You need to do what you can do. Struggle for a few days but get that done. So it's important that not to be a diva about that. But this is more from the sense of this something that is becoming a habit, like a pattern. So you do that by setting these boundaries up front. Let people know that this is my working hours, these are my working hours, this is how much time it's going to take me to get back to you on this. And let people know, for example, if you're a freelancer that's working with a bunch of different clients and one client is like, we need this, remind them that you have responsibilities to other clients as well. They wouldn't like it if you didn't deliver for them because you were working on something else. So that's something that you apply equally to everyone. And the third thing is to negotiate timelines. So what happens many times is product release timelines often get decided by product and engineering. And then it comes to design. They're like, okay, so you have only 3 weeks to do this. So while it's great if you were able to be a part of that conversation and upfront decide how much time you need, if that's practically not the case, then you still need to negotiate what you can and cannot do within that timeline. So other functions again tend to be a little quite tangible. So it's easy to say that from other points of view that we need X amount of hours and we need X amount of resources to do this. And design, because people still see it as a little bit fuzzy, they can kind of try and push for it. But again, it's about breaking those things down, like I spoke about earlier, and saying, no, we need this much time to do this right. we can do this much in this amount of time, and again have those conversations with people. This is about imposter syndrome. I'm sure a lot of you already know what that is. Imposter syndrome is basically, even though you have a lot of accomplishments, you have the skills, you still feel like you don't belong there. You still feel like you're a fraud, and everyone else is so much better and that at work, and you don't have what it takes, and you're just sitting around waiting to be found out. This is something that I think a lot of us face at different points of time. So it's important to just call it out and talk about ways to tackle it. I think the first way is to just keep creating, like just keep putting stuff out there, because the larger the volume of work that you do, the more confidence you start building. And even though you might feel that imposter syndrome coming on, you know that I have felt this before and I have tackled it before, so I will do it again. Um, the next is to identify your wins. So, and this doesn't mean sitting down when when it's time to kind of revamp your portfolio and then thinking about, oh, what have I done, or if it's your time for your performance evaluation at work and then you're doing the same thing. I think a better way to do this is to keep reflecting on your work from time to time and just making like really quick notes about what you've done, wins you've had. If you've walked away from a situation thinking I handled that really well, or you had a success at work, then just make a note of it somewhere so that you can come back to it later and remind yourself that you have done stuff that you should be proud of. The third thing is easier said than done. It's to not compare yourself with other people, because you don't know how someone got to where they are. You don't know what advantages they've had. You don't know what issues they've had. So it's very easy from the outside to form this model that, oh, this person they could do this, then they're the same age and they had the same background as me, but why have I not achieved as much? It doesn't work. I mean, everyone has their own story. So just kind of focus on yours and try and avoid getting into comparisons.
And definitely don't compare it against the Instagram profiles, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay.
And don't seek approval. I mean, I think this is a trap that we all kind of fall into, where we do something and then we want to be told that, hey, you did great work and this was amazing and you're great to work with and things like that. And the reality is, most people don't think of saying these things to other people, right? I mean, they might think it might just be a thought, it might go away. They may not articulate it to you. So don't kind of sit around waiting for people to say nice things about you. Uh, if you really need that, then look to things like, uh, is there a client that keeps coming back to you? Are there team members that keep asking you for your inputs on things? These are good indicators of the fact that people consider you to be a good designer. And ultimately, I think it's about not trying to create this ideal in your head of I need to be this to be a good designer. It's more about identifying what your strengths are, what you're good at, and also what your kind of inclination is. Maybe you're an introvert, maybe, and so you don't kind of enjoy the more extroverted aspects of design, or maybe you're an extrovert and you don't like the more introverted aspects of it. Definitely do learn and grow. I mean, if you see something you like in somebody else, then it's great to kind of internalize that and think about why you like that, and if that's something you want to make better about yourself, do that. But again, it's about becoming the best version that you can be, as opposed to some other ideal, like an external ideal. So now we're kind of going more and more inwards into the whole journey. And this is about dealing with uncertainty as a designer, because we do have to design is intangible. And so we do have to handle that in many different ways. I think day to day, it's important to get comfortable with uncertainty. I think Sharon, you mentioned election. I think there might be times when you don't get enough inputs from people. You might have to find the right people and try and get the right information. Or you might make a design, it gets scrapped, you have to go back to the drawing boards. Or like you said, no matter how much information you have, sometimes it's not enough, or you feel like it's not enough, right? Uh, so then it's important then to realize that while you should try and seek out data and qualitative data and all of that to do your work, you will not always have that, and so you have to be comfortable with then designing from a subjective point of view, and also being okay just with the fact that you won't have certainty in what you do. So this is sort of more on a day-to-day, from a day-to-day perspective. I think long-term, it's important to not to embrace uncertainty by not getting too settled in a particular niche. So we've heard about this T-shape in design, right? So you grow horizontally across different design disciplines, and then you go vertically, specialize in one of them or more of them. This is great, but I think being a design generalist is kind of underrated, because it's good to be able to dabble between all of these different functions. I think that makes you more adaptable. It gives you a better perspective. It makes you more. It makes it easier for you to adapt to different environments, different situations, different challenges, and which overall helps you grow better as a designer. So this point is more about if you've been too focused on, let's say, interaction design, then learn more about user research tools, go into that a little bit, try to do some animation, do some prototyping. The same if you're from a research bent of mind, don't completely ignore the design aspect. It is a way that you will actually get your research to the user. So yeah, so that's kind of the point there. And it's also important to kind of not get too settled in a particular industry. I think that does happen sometimes, is you kind of go into an enterprise company, and then you get comfortable, and then that's all you ever do. Change it up, move to a startup, see what it's like to take decisions that have really fast timelines and really fast outputs into turnaround. So the design gets shipped out within a matter of weeks, not months or years. And if you're working in a startup for a long time, try and go to a bigger company which has more structure, which has more process, and kind of see how it is to work within those things, where things are a lot more established and certain things are made a lot easier for you, and certain things are more difficult for sure. Switch between consumer and enterprise. So the point here basically is to not get too comfortable in any one particular aspect of this, but keep yourself fresh and keep moving, no matter how old you might be in your career. Which actually brings me to my final insight, which is learning when to let go. Um, we talked about like all of these different ways in which you need to kind of step up and do things. But I think it's also important to know that we do sometimes get stuck in these patterns, we get stuck in these ruts, and it's important to know when it's time to let go. Analysis paralysis, and you might have heard this term. It's when you do so much analysis that you become paralyzed and you can't take any action at the end of it. And this does happen. I mean, it has definitely happened to me, where and it's not just an internal thing. It can happen within teams where you're constantly iterating, you're constantly getting more and more inputs from different stakeholders. Your design is constantly being revised. Um, and while iteration is good, you do need to do that. It has to be done in a meaningful way. Because if you don't do that, then the opportunity cost is going to be too great. It's never going to get out there, right? There's kind of two aspects to this. I think one is while taking design decisions, you might jump around between a bunch of different things, moving things here and there, trying this, trying that. Ultimately, you need to take a decision based on something and just go with it. Put it out there. And once you get the feedback, then you can iterate further. The other thing is to kind of move between different phases of design. So if you spend so much time because you were understanding your user and you did a lot of user research, that you don't have enough time to iterate a bunch of different solutions, then you're kind of losing out there. Or if you've spent so much time iterating on solutions that you don't have enough time to test them out, again, that's a loss. So it's kind of important to call it out when you get stuck in this sort of a like a rut or whatever, and move on from there. The other thing is about delegating. So I mean, this is as designers, I think we talk a lot about wanting ownership over our work, but the reality is that you will work in teams. Even if you're a junior designer, you're working with other team members, and if you're a lead designer, then you have junior designers working with you. And no one person can do everything by themselves. So even if you might have this vision and you feel like the only way to get it done is if you do it yourself, uh, you do need to be able to delegate in a smart manner. So one thing is to be able to give up control, to give people direction and not micromanage them. So it's kind of a fine line between helping other people get to the vision through their own paths, which might be different from the way you might have done it. But I think as long as you're working towards that common vision and it's getting accomplished, that should be good enough. Um, how do you know whether you're micromanaging or not? I think one rule of thumb is if your team members have to keep coming to you for every little question and every little decision, then you probably are micromanaging. So then if that starts to happen, then kind of help your team members take decisions on their own. Again, like harking back to what something I mentioned earlier is don't give them the solution. Don't tell them don't do it this way, do it that way. Help them frame it as a problem and then let them solution themselves. And it's also important to find the right people. So this is probably more for senior people that are hiring. At least when I am hiring, I tend to pay more uh, focused on the portfolio of the designer as opposed to the resume, because even if they've graduated from a really great university, I'm more interested in seeing the work that they've done, because that shows how they think. It shows what sort of a person they would be to work with. Um, so it's also important to kind of keep those things in mind to find the right people to then delegate to. And then this is just about walking away. So we've talked a lot about what you can do to make a stronger impact, how you can get buy-in for your ideas. But the thing is, no matter how well reasoned your argument is or how well thought out your solution is, there will be times when it just won't go ahead, and the team might decide to go in another direction. So it's important to know that you can't win all arguments. All you can do is to just do your work and make these reasoned arguments through the different ways that we've been talking about in this conversation. But be okay with them giving up and saying, okay, this is not going to happen. So in a sense, it's like that kind of an approach to your work. And the other thing is walking away when something is non-negotiable for you. So for example, maybe you've put in a lot of effort, invested a lot of time, but you feel like your client or your company doesn't place the same value on UX, on good user experience that you do. Or maybe it is the fact that you're a freelancer and you keep getting so many offers that you're not able to say no to them, even though you have a full plate. Um, so maybe there is a culture fit or something like that, lack of a culture fit. So these are all if something comes up basically that doesn't gel with your internal value system, then again it's totally okay to walk away from that. I guess the most important thing is to stay calm and carry on creating, because that's what we do best. So it's kind of, I see it as a balance between being more action oriented, being proactive, going outwards, doing all of these different things so that we get do our work more effectively and get heard better and ultimately make more of an impact in our organizations. And also being a little bit more introspective, kind of looking back on what's happened, uh, learn some lessons, identify some patterns, and apply that, and start, kind of keep building on an internal value system for yourself. So yeah, these are the 7 ways I think you can grow as a designer.
Brilliant, brilliant. Pratibha, this has been an extremely personal kind of talk, I think. I really love the points that you've made. But it leads me to ask one question. Does having a good understanding of human nature make you a good designer? Is that necessarily a skill?
I think so. I mean, that's interesting. I didn't really think of it from that point of view, but I think you do, because not only, like, sure, we always talk about understanding the user, and that's definitely a good skill to have when you're let's say interviewing a bunch of users and trying to understand. But I think it also helps a lot within the organization, which I think is what a lot of this talk has been about. It's about working with collaborating with other people, working with other people in your organization. And if you're a good reader of human nature, I think you kind of read the room better when you're in discussions. You get a better sense of other people's motivations or what's working, what doesn't work when you speak with them, and that helps you have a better conversation.
I'm going to just ask you another question about delegation. I face this a lot, but I would like your perspective on it. So you get to this point where you know you can do this better, but you have to delegate. So how do you get comfortable with that idea,
Yeah,
especially when the output isn't as good as you expected? Maybe
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not
And
complaining here, by the way, guys. This is for the red team. That's it's not a complaint. I'm just asking the question so we get her perspective. Yeah.
yeah, no, I've definitely been there as well.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of an organic process. Like, it typically starts out with you having a discussion about here's what we're trying to do, and then you think everyone is on the same page. But like you said, sometimes you realize that they're not when you see the output. Um, I think again the thing there is it's very tempting to say like why have you gone with this? Use this, use don't use a carousel, use a go with a card based thing because it will be better in this way. Um, but again, I think that's something that we want to avoid because then you're hand holding people too much. And many times I've also had designers look for that kind of input. It's almost like, uh, I mean, I'm not very sure, I'm new, and I'm not. So you tell me what's better, and then I learn. But I think if you learn better by doing, even if it's a little harder to receive criticism. And this is actually something that Milind and I kind of debated a bit when we were in Android design, and we were working with junior designers. And so Milind is my partner, was my partner in Android design, and his approach is to be brutally honest. So he would very be like I mean I would feel a little bit bad some of the conversations that we would have, and I would be like, can't we be more diplomatic about this? And his point was, um, I'd rather not be diplomatic because then the other person isn't going to really understand what I'm trying to say. I would rather be honest about it. So I think ultimately we kind of came to this kind of a compromise where you are honest about it, but you try and say it in a nice way. um, but to answer your question, I think it's about having these conversations, but trying and keeping it as high level as possible. So if you presented a certain design, you would say, well, how is it important for the user to do X, Y, Z? And then the other person might say, well, yeah, they do. They're like, okay, so then how would they do it with this approach? And they're like, okay, no, wait, that is a problem. Okay, then how about we do it like this? So I think it's more about ideating with them, but not going into the solution mindset, staying more at the high level of helping them define what the problems are first.
Okay. I have a question here from Tanvi. She's in design school. I'll ask her a question in the reverse order. She's asking, what are the things I should take advantage of while still in design school?
Ah, um, I think definitely as much theory as you can, because that's something you will not get in the real world. And I've spoken with a lot of designers that have not studied design. They just kind of started working. They come from different backgrounds. They start working in design, and they often feel like that's something missing, which is a way to structure their arguments or give a reason for why they're doing things a certain way. And I think design school helps you a lot with that. It helps you in learning these different tools, these different processes. And by tools, I don't mean Sketch. I mean things like let's say creating a user journey map, or when to do qualitative versus quantitative testing. It helps you in all these. It helps you in your process a great deal. So when you're faced with a real world challenge, you know which of these tools to apply, and it helps you kind of break your work down. So you're not again just designing from a bunch of scattered inputs. It helps you go a little bit deeper into your attacking your problem.
Okay. She's got another question about just give me a second. Sorry. What are your views on pursuing a master's, especially in the context of today's world?
Right. I do think there is value in that. Again, for this, it's actually my answer is going to be very similar to what I just said. I think being in the real world helps you get really good dealing with things practically, but it can also lead to like feeling a little bit like don't have your roots, you don't have a solid foundation, and that this is just my personal experience. It may not be true for everyone, but when you have that design degree, it gives you that foundation. It gives you these techniques. It gives you these tools to frame everything in. It makes you make better arguments. It makes you uh, know how, give you different ways in which to solve problems as opposed to just coming up with ideas. So I do definitely see value in that, even today.
One more question from Bai. What kind of case studies are standing out more than others? And how to stand out when your projects are more small budget projects
More small?
or small budget projects?
Okay. Um,
I
I
suspect
think,
he's a freelancer. So,
okay. Yeah. I think this is where the narrative becomes really important. I think a lot of the way freelance projects tend to be is that the client comes in and they're like, we want a website for our company, or we want a landing page or something like that. And then you just kind of work off whatever inputs you get from them, and then when they say okay, then you are done. And so at the end of that, all you have to show is just the website. Maybe you did a few flow diagrams or something, but that's about it. uh, I think it's important here to start framing the narrative, that story arc that I was talking about, where you kind of uh, work to define clearly who the users are, uh, and then you talk about what problems they face, talk about the key insight you had, which is why you went in this particular direction, and then detail out your solution. Because when you tell that, no matter how small, it could even be like a really tiny feature, or it could even just be even a checkbox on a page. But if there was this sort of a solid reasoning, it resonates with people. They understand truly what it was that you were doing when you present it in this manner.
sure. Pradhaman asks, how do you start working on a project with business goals in mind while doing a project in college? Where it's purely academic, I suppose.
Okay. Um, yeah, that's a little bit tricky because if you don't already have a business background, then you do tend to focus on it from a purely user point of view. Uh, I guess if your project is with is with an actual company or an organization, then obviously then you go to them for those kinds of inputs. But if you're doing something like um, you're trying to redesign Twitter, I don't know, that's a bad example, but something which doesn't have these external stakeholders, um, then I think it is important to kind of set out. Maybe there, that is where you need to think a little bit more about the business perspective as well, because without that, it might you might end up with something that's really unrealistic. So maybe read a little bit, look at what competitors are doing, kind of try and see what their business models are. I'm not saying get too detailed about it, but understand at a high level how different companies make their money. It could even be as simple as the apps that we use today, right? And kind of use those and keep it high level, but kind of use that as a way to structure the business aspect a little bit.
He's going to follow up saying, is it fine to set your own business goals, like increasing transactions or basic goals to reduce drop-offs?
I didn't quite get that.
So can you define your own business goals while in college? Is that helpful, is what he's asking.
Yeah, definitely. I think, again, if you have an external stakeholder that plays the business function, it's very useful for the goals to come from them, or you suggest to them, does this make sense? But yeah, if you're defining it yourself, then I think having some goals that are rooted in logic is definitely good to have.
Okay. I don't want to get into specifics, but I just want to ask you a broader question because you're running your own firm. This is, I think we have a lot of freelancers here. So how do you go about figuring out how much to charge for your work?
Yeah, that is tricky, right?
Yeah.
I think that's something we struggle with as well. Um, it comes from maybe doing some research upfront, kind of look around to see how much other people are charging. If it's not the first time you're working, if you worked before, let's say, compare that with your baseline. So let's say you were earning a certain amount as a salary, and that was okay for you, then you want to make sure that you're at least hitting that much, if not more. But I think it's a very hard thing to define. I know that's not the answer you want to hear, but it kind of comes with trying to get a sense of the market as much as possible. Start with something, and then day to day, I think you start realizing um, how much, whether you're working too much for the amount that you're earning, in which case you need to change one or the other. Um, but I think it's a very personal thing. It's something that you kind of end up defining over time for yourself.
Just a follow from Tanvi, she's asking, is it still important to do masters because most of what you spoke about is being covered in bachelor's right now for her
Is being covered
in her undergrad, uh,
oh,
right? Yeah.
okay. Um, I think like I think it's a subjective thing. I think like I personally feel it that a lot of when you work in the real world, when you're in design school, it's a lot more structured. So the projects you do are still in a more sterile kind of an atmosphere. But when you get out there, you realize that things move really fast, and you have to think on your feet. So at this time, it's good to have some sort of a grounding. Uh, that said, if you already are studying a bachelor's in design, I would say it makes more sense for you to work for some time first, and then you think about whether you want to do a master's or not. Like, I think for you, I wouldn't say go and do a master's right away because you already are studying design.
Sure.
So when I say design school, I meant like not necessarily a master's, but even a some sort of a degree in design.
Okay. I've got a broad question. What do you feel that designers across the board in India, at least in India, weren't doing?
What they're doing
What they weren't doing? What do you feel that they should not be doing?
should not be doing.
Yeah.
Um, I think this is especially more the case in India because our industry is a little bit younger than let's say the US, which is a lot more mature now.
I
I
agree.
think I talked a bit about these design as being perceived as purely aesthetic. It's something that I feel we're still guilty of as a design community. I think we look at things and we look at this really, when we say well designed, even within the design community, we often uh, think more in terms of the visuals. Uh, so I think that's something we want to walk away from a little bit. I think we also need to start tying ourselves more closely with the business functionality. So not see ourselves as these separate people that will come in and plug a function into your company, but as an integral part that's missing, and we're going to work closely with all of these other functions. Um, yeah, I think we need to be more integrated. We need to also, I think, and this started to happen for a bit for us in Andor, which is kind of start venturing a little bit more into the product space. Not to say you are a product manager, because that is a completely different ball game, but a little bit more overlap between that than just being about pure design.
Sounds great. That's uh, that's those are the questions here, Pratibha. It was
Okay.
really a very lovely talk. There are lots of compliments on the chat for you. Very lovely presentations and very amazing insights, as mentioned here. By the way, there are requests for this recording to be put up. Is there, if there's no issue with that, or your presentation, do you mind
Yeah, no,
sharing
that's
with me?
fine.
Okay,
That's fine.
we'll make it available. All right. Thanks a lot for doing this again. It was
Thank
really
you guys for inviting me.
Thank you so much for doing this.
great, guys. Thank you all for attending. We'll catch up with you in next Excel. All right. Bye.
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 Cheers.